So just from outside Montreal, Canada, welcome Melissa Agnes.
Good morning. Engagement right away. So in the summer of 2014, the folks at Emory University Hospital faced a major challenge. But luckily, this was a challenge they were ready for. They had trained with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Their entire staff knew the protocol. They even had a special ward that was specifically prepared and ready to go. They were ready to fight Ebola. And they were proud when they learned that summer that they would have the honor of flying 2 American missionary doctors who had been stationed in West Africa and who had unfortunately contracted the disease to their hospital for care. Emory is a very engaged organization within their community, so the next step for them came naturally. It was to announce all of this news, this great news, to their community. So they did. They created editorials. They shared those editorials on social media. And within minutes, news was going viral about this announcement, but not in a way that Emory expected or anticipated. I spoke with the people at Emory, and they said that within minutes, what felt like hundreds of emails were just flooding their inbox. They had comments on social media that said things like, "You are bringing the plague into our country, shame on you." They had prominent figures and celebrities taking to Twitter to voice their discontent with the situation. Tweets that were garnering thousands upon thousands of retweets. And of course, the media was eating this up, adding to the narrative, creating more noise, overwhelming Emory, detracting from their important message and mission with this negative virality. If you were faced with a situation like this, if you found yourselves in Emory's shoes, where you were excited to make this great announcement, and all of a sudden you're blindsided, really, with this negativity that's going viral, who here, please be honest, feels that if that were to happen, your team would be ready? The team would know what to do? By a show of hands. Who feels that you would be completely unprepared? Hands. Who feels that you would wing it and maybe yes, maybe no? More hands. We live in complex times, don't we? Technology has completely transformed the landscape for crisis management. Social media, which is one aspect of technology, has made it so that every single person has a platform to voice whatever it is they're doing or feeling at any given time. And man, do people like to voice what they're doing and feeling. So much so that there's this sign that is displayed in the emergency stairwell of public buildings around the US, around North America, kind of scattered throughout. The sign reads, "In case of fire, exit building before tweeting about it." Everybody laughs. I love showing this because it gets you guys to laugh. But the reality is that this isn't a meme that's circulating the web. This is actually a warning sign that says, in the event of an emergency, get yourselves to safety and then share your experience. And this is actually displayed in buildings. And yet, or I should say because, it precisely depicts our society today. People have this insatiable urge to share what they experience as they experience it in real time to the social web. And while this hyperconnectivity has presented us with some amazing opportunities when it comes to marketing and PR and stakeholder engagement, the flip side, the downside, is that it also presents us with some amplified challenges when it comes to crisis management, like the story of Emory, as just a small example. The noise that we have to be prepared to effectively manage, filter through, and rise above so that your important communications in times of crisis are heard above and through that noise can be often overwhelming and very distracting. As an example, during the Boston Marathon bombings, Within the first 3 hours from the times the bombs went off, there were over 500,000 tweets with the hashtag Boston Marathon. That's over 500,000 tweets with that one hashtag. That doesn't account for any other tweet that had any other hashtag, any other tweet that didn't have a hashtag, any Facebook post, any Instagram video, any YouTube video, any news article that was published, indexing in Google, and then shared. So the noise that we have to be prepared to filter through and manage and rise above in order for your organization to own the narrative of your own crisis is extremely overwhelming, can be. And yet there's this need, this demand, this expectation that you will respond, that an organization in times of crisis will be ready and willing to communicate. And the longer we take to communicate, unfortunately, the more control of the narrative we lose, and the more stakeholder trust and credibility we lose. As an example, in October of 2015, the CEO of United Airlines, Oscar Munoz, suffered a heart attack and was brought to the hospital. United, as a result of this, was forced to postpone a union leadership summit that had been on the calendar for months. They chose not to disclose the reason for the postponement. The next day, the Wall Street Journal was one of the first credible media sources, one of the first actually media sources, to report on the incident. In the wake of the initial media reports, United watched as their stock price began to drop by 3%. So they decided to issue a statement. This statement basically says three things. It's very short. It was put out almost 24 hours after the fact, once the stock prices began to drop. It basically says three things. It says our CEO is in the hospital. It doesn't disclose why, even though that news, that information was already circulating. It says we will continue to keep you updated as we deem it appropriate. I'm paraphrasing, but as we deem it appropriate. And here we have stakeholders saying, as you deem it appropriate, you didn't even tell us he was in the hospital. The only reason you're talking now is because stock prices are beginning to drop and media is making this whole big fuss about it. So when are you going to deem to find it appropriate to continue to communicate with us? And then it says that business is operating as usual. But 2 points here. One, your CEO is in the hospital. How are you operating as normal? And two, you canceled or you postponed a senior leadership summit that had been on the calendar for months. So clearly you're not operating as normal. So of course, over the span of the weekend, so this was a Friday that they put this out, over the span of the weekend, the media continued to speculate, to write about report about how United was not communicating, was mismanaging the crisis. And social media was lighting up with speculation and rumors about who was going to take Munoz's place, how severe his heart attack was. Nobody's communicating at United. Finally, the Monday later, the Monday afternoon, actually almost evening, it's about 6 o'clock, if I'm not mistaken, that this official announcement from United actually was put out. This statement finally says what everybody had already known for 4 days, which was our CEO's in the hospital on account of a heart attack. And then it actually answered the pertinent questions that key stakeholders had and were discussing online. They announced who they would name as interim CEO for the time being. And it was only when United put out a more official, more thorough, transparent communication that they started to see their stock price rise back to normal levels. And they finally silenced all of the noise. So there's this direct correlation, and we see it all the time, between the time delay that organizations take to communicate while managing a crisis and the impact that that time delay has on the organization. And yet, the noise continues to spiral, right, when we don't communicate. All of the speculation, all of the impact continues to spiral. And the reality, though, is that on the back end of things, is that we don't have access to all of the information that people may expect of us right from the start. So there's this constant struggle behind the scenes between balancing timeliness and accuracy, as I'm sure you very well know. We saw this recently with the Samsung Galaxy Note 7 crisis. So remember the phones that were exploding globally, injuring customers, and at that point, airlines around the world were prohibiting these devices onto their aircrafts. So this was a global crisis for Samsung. And yet, right from the start, Samsung had this want to communicate. They even sent an internal memo that said, we are here because of our customers. They deserve for us to keep them safe, I'm paraphrasing, but they deserve to keep us safe, and we need to communicate to give them the information that they need. So they showed this want to communicate right from the start with the right intentions. And yet, their timely, transparent communications were one of their crisis management downfalls. They were so quick to communicate that they ended up making retractions that confused customers. They were so quick to issue a recall in the States that they frustrated regulators because they didn't make the recalls in accordance with the regulations. And every time there was a retraction or a confusion or a frustration, the media ate it up, criticizing Samsung for their lack of effective crisis management. So it's kind of like this double-edged sword, isn't it? The noise is spiraling out of control. Even with the best intentions, it's difficult to communicate in a time that is, or in a way that's timely, but also balances that need for accuracy so you don't end up sticking your foot in your mouth and amplifying your own challenges in the crisis. And these realities today are true for every single organization, whether you're a major global organization or you're a small local shop company. The digital landscape, technology, the reality is that it's leveled the playing field. All of the challenges and obstacles, just as all of the opportunities, the playing field is leveled. They're the same for every single organization. It used to be that only the bigger organizations really had to worry about crisis preparedness or crisis management. But today it's not the case, and we see that all the time. We see small organizations face issues that go viral, crises that go viral, just as we see the big ones, and the playing field is really leveled. And then on top of all of this, unfortunately, we live in a world of increased risk. There is risk everywhere, from the risk that we always had to face and deal with and manage and prepare for, prevent, to cybersecurity, to the risk of live streaming that can amplify the noise in a crisis. All of these risks. We live in a world of increased risk. Who wants me to get off the stage right now and leave? So in a world of increased risk and seemingly impossible demands and expectations when it comes to crisis management, the big question is, how can you prepare for success? And how can you prepare for success in a way that transforms these realities, let's call them, realities that can either be challenges but transform them instead into your crisis management advantage so that you can quickly position your organization as the voice of trust, credibility, and leadership right at the onset of a crisis. And that's what I want to do with you here today. I want to give you 3 tips that are so simple that you're going to think, what the hell is she talking about? This can't be crisis preparedness. And that you can actually take away and implement and leave here feeling more crisis prepared and being more crisis ready. So the answer has always been to be prepared. How do you plan for success? By being prepared. But today the reality is that the level of preparedness has drastically increased. So it used to be that smart organizations would take the time to draft a crisis management plan. Everybody picture that plan in your head, it's about this thick, right? Sitting on a shelf somewhere, in a drawer, in a file. And it gives leadership solace knowing that if a crisis were to strike the organization, you could reach for that plan, you can open it up, you could follow it, and it would guide you through to crisis management success. And while the act of planning remains to be invaluable, the reality is that by the time you reach for that plan today, the story is already miles ahead of you. Stakeholders are already demanding answers. They have questions. There's rumors, speculation, misinformation. It's already there. You're already playing catch-up. So today, the required level of preparedness is to not solely rely on that plan as the end-all, be-all, this is going to guide us through, but instead to develop and implement a program, a crisis preparedness program, that you embed into the very culture of the organization. Do me a favor. close your eyes right now and imagine a crisis scenario that when you think about this scenario, first of all, it's likely. It's a likely event to occur to your organization. And when you think about it, your heart sinks to your stomach and you think, I don't think that we wouldn't be able to manage that right away. We wouldn't know, we'd be chasing our tails for a little bit. Now imagine, that at the breaking moments of that crisis happening, that you and your leadership, your colleagues, they know it, that everybody within the organization, from department to department, from region to region, instinctively will know exactly what their roles and responsibilities are, how to prevent escalation, what's expected of them both by leadership and external stakeholders, and how to go about meeting those expectations. Imagine a world, an organization, where this is intrinsic. It's a knowledge, it's instinctive. And leadership doesn't have to think about that plan. It's there as a security blanket, as a safety net, but there's this knowledge that even if a crisis were to strike at 2 a.m. on a Saturday, that the team the following Sunday morning would know what to do. That's the level of required preparedness of today. And I'm going to give you 3 steps to take, simple steps that will help you be better prepared, be more crisis ready to that capacity. First step, identify your risk. Understand. So we used to take crisis preparedness as more of a generalistic approach to it. This binder was so big because it really summarized everything. But everybody, I saw you guys close your eyes, thank you. Everybody closed their eyes and they pictured, I'm sure, a scenario. So there are a handful of high-risk scenarios that are the most likely types of crises to occur to strike your organization. What are they? They're the most likely types of crises to occur. So that's the first step, is to truly identify what the risks are. And from there, to better understand, or to seek to understand, if you don't already, the difference between issue and crisis. Because today we have, with all of the noise, with all of the challenges that we have to face in a crisis, it's very easy to get overwhelmed and to miscategorize an incident. It's very easy to say an issue that's going viral feels like a crisis in the heat of the moment, and to wrongfully escalate an incident unnecessarily, and to amplify your challenges, or to overreact, or to underreact. So if we can get a mic, I'd love to hear from you. What do you think, just off the top of your head, or scream it out if we can, the difference between issue and crisis? How does your organization define that in a few words? Anybody? Yes?
Severity and impact.
Severity of impact. Okay. How do you judge that?
We use risk assessment tools, time permitting.
Okay. You use risk assessment tools, tying it in. That's what you said?
Time permitting risk assessment.
Time permitting. Okay. Good. That's okay. We'll talk about it. So issue versus crisis. As a baseline, whenever I'm starting with a client, this is what I bring in with me, and then you can take it and you can adjust it to fit your organization. So a couple things. Crisis it's going to stop the organization. It's going to be something that is to a level of potential catastrophe, whether it's talking about long-term impact, negative impact on people, on environment, on operations, on reputation, or on bottom line. It's going to be an event where it's going to be all hands on deck, business as usual kind of stops, at least for some key people. And you have to manage this incident because the long-term impact on those 5 things, people, environment, operations, reputation, bottom line, is at risk. It's that long-term impact factor. Whereas issue, it's a negative event. Issues are negative events. Issues can go viral in a negative way. But the way that I look at that is that, does this negative issue that may be going viral, does it threaten long-term impact on those 5 things? It's a good baseline to start from, and then with that, you can build upon it and really look at your high-risk scenarios and say, okay, when would this be an issue, and when would this start escalating to crisis level? Have these conversations internally. It's really important so that you don't have to rely on time permitting, right, with the tools, which are great tools, but you want it to be intrinsic. I want to play a little game. So because it's very abstract what I'm saying. So I'm going to show you a couple pictures and just scream it out, or we also have a mic, Chris is ready with a mic, and tell me if you think what I'm going to show you was an issue or a crisis, and in a couple words why. Ready? I talked about Emory. Issue or crisis? Issue. Anybody say crisis? Everybody says issue. Why? A couple words. So it didn't affect those 5 things that I've named. Day-to-day operations are still going, more of a PR issue. Anybody else? Great answer. Anybody else? All right, so issue, and that's why. Didn't affect those 5 things. Issue or crisis? Hindsight is 20/20, but issue or crisis? Unanimous. Crisis. Why? Bottom line. Gross impact on the bottom line. Reputation. People. All those things, right? Great. Last one. Crisis. Why? Crisis. Bottom line, operational, reputation. Now, hindsight again being 20/20. This one in particular, foreseeable? Not really?
It happened before when airlines had incidents with passengers. Nothing escalated to this point.
Nothing went viral to that capacity. It was the perfect storm. When it happened, was it foreseeable? If you looked and you quickly assessed the situation, I see heads nodding yes. When it happened, when that video went out, was it foreseeable?
Yeah.
Yes, because of those things that we're talking about, right? United took, I believe it was 16 or 17 hours, one of the two, either way, unacceptable, to actually put out a response. And their response was similar to the one that we saw earlier. Did nothing. So foreseeable and yet delayed response amplified unnecessarily the repercussions. Yes?
Normally, isn't it that an issue is not dealt with properly and effectively or immediately leads to a crisis?
It can. It can. The thing, so the question was, normally an issue, if it's not handled properly, it will potentially turn into a crisis. The thing with issues, and this again, everything I'm talking about doesn't matter the size of your organization. This is about business today. It's about people. So the thing with issues is that issues can happen sporadically. They could also happen long-term. They can happen long-term, not impact long-term. Difference. And the thing that you have, the opportunity that comes out of issue is you can respond inappropriately, and each time it happens, rehappens or a new issue happens, it chips away at your credibility, the trust, and the reputation of the organization. Or, if you can identify them and you know how to respond, then you could do the opposite. You can put goodwill, or increase goodwill. You can build upon the trust and the credibility with your stakeholders of the organization. So issues, we're talking about how to get ahead of the noise and how to be crisis ready so that you know what to do. Understanding this, defining definitions, or the mark point on when it becomes an issue and when it's a crisis, or vice versa, is one of the most important first steps. And it requires conversations to be had internally. It's not something to assume. It's really something to communicate, to discuss amongst your team, because everybody is going to see risk differently. Your CIO is going to be focused on cybersecurity. Your HR is going to be focused on disgruntled employees or workplace violence. Everybody in this room may have, you all envision probably something different, more or less, in your minds. So this is really about having these conversations, and it's really, really empowering just in and of itself when you start doing this. So that's step one. Actually, this here is a flow chart. I call it an issue management response flow chart for online, for social media issues. melissaagnes.com if you're interested. It's a free download. It's to help your team better quickly assess when to respond in a negative incident versus when to sit back and let it unfold versus when to escalate it to crisis level. Free download if you think that it would be helpful, and then do what you want with it. Make it your own if you want to tweak it to really apply to your organization. But it's about giving your team also those tools so that they can understand the risk as well and those points of escalation. And then the second thing that I want to talk about, the step 2, is to identify and understand your stakeholders. So we're talking about really big expectations and demands in times of crisis. But what are they? It's only by truly understanding who your stakeholders are and what they will expect of the organization in times of crisis that you'll be in a position to meet those expectations, to anticipate them, and to meet them, and hopefully exceed them. So I want to start with who your stakeholders are, because I think that probably everybody in this room, you're thinking of a few stakeholder groups. But the reality is, in my experience, I have yet to come across an organization that has a list of all their stakeholder groups that apply to their organization in one place. Who are your stakeholders? Who are each one of your stakeholder groups? Have that list. That list enables you to not forget anybody in the heat of the moment, in all of the haste. And then with that list, you can then cross-reference them with your high-risk scenarios, and you can say, in the event of scenario A, crisis type A, what would our customers expect from us? What would our employees expect of us? If you have investors, what would they expect of us? What would our board expect of us? Go through that list and really seek to understand what would be expected of you in a crisis. In each one of those scenarios, what would be their pertinent questions that they expect you to have answers to, that they'll demand you to have answers to? Can you foresee those questions now and give your team a head start so that you can communicate in an effective, timely, transparent, and yet still, balancing that need for accuracy time frame? With United, one of their downfalls was that minimalistic statement that they put out did nothing to address the key concerns in this particular case, we're looking at investors. And that's why stock price began to drop. They weren't saying, okay, fine, business as usual, but what does that mean? What's your plan? Do you have a plan? They're common questions that we can actually anticipate and begin to at least have a list of, this is what I do with clients. I say, okay, each one of your stakeholder groups, each one of your scenarios, let's do an FAQ. We may not have the answers, but we can talk about tone of messaging. We can just make sure that we can anticipate what their needs will be, what their key concerns will be, so that we're in a position to remember that and to effectively communicate that in real time when things are starting to go crazy, especially online, when the noise is leveling up. And then in addition to that is, where do your stakeholders expect to have this information? You have to meet them on their turf today. So, are they going to instinctively navigate to your website? If so, that's where you need to be communicating. Are they going to go to Facebook? Are they going to go to Twitter? Are they going to pick up the phone and call you? Or better yet, are they going to expect for somebody on your team to pick up the phone and call them? Answer these questions now, and you will be in a position to instinctively, it always goes back to that instinct. I don't want it to be reliant on a plan. I want it to be a knowledge from everybody in the organization that says, okay, my stakeholder group is so-and-so, I own the relationships, here's what they're going to expect of us in this type of situation. We have our questions, I know what to do. When I talked about the Boston Marathon bombing, within the first 5 minutes, right? Well, within the first 3 hours, it was going crazy. Within the first 5 minutes, it was starting to go crazy. Everybody was online. And it was only because the superintendent-in-chief at the time, Daniel Linsky, he was the commander-in-chief of that tragic crisis. And his first instinct, so Dan goes, when in a crisis, his training tells him that he goes on the radio, he picks up the radio, and he goes to his team and he gives them 5 directives. This is how he works. This gives his team objectives, focus points. And his 5th thing within the first 5 minutes from those bombs going off was, get on social media. The community is going to need communication. They are going to expect to hear from us. We have to continue to communicate. We have to be where they're going to be. Activate social media. And as a result of that intuition, of understanding that particular stakeholder and what they were going to need in those very, very hectic and discerning times where nobody knew if they were still safe or if they were safe yet. It was because Dan knew who his stakeholders were, where they were going to be, and what they expected of the agency that Boston PD, a law enforcement organization, which is almost unheard of, especially in 2013, they didn't just manage to get ahead of all of that noise that I showed you earlier. They actually managed to position themselves to be the credible source of information throughout the crisis, where not even the media would publish something before they fact-checked it on Boston PD's channels. That is getting ahead of the noise, and that was a lot of noise to have to get ahead of, and yet getting ahead of it could mean the difference between life and death in this particular situation. So, biggest challenges you could imagine facing in a crisis with the biggest critical initiatives, and yet they did it because they understood the stakeholder, they understood the platform, they met them on their turf, and they were ready to meet those expectations. Simple. Again, let's break it down. Understand or identify who your key stakeholder groups are. Every touch point, every person, every group of people or entities that matters to your business, have a list drawn up. And then cross-reference those with your high-risk scenarios and say, in this type of scenario, what would each of these stakeholder groups expect of us? What would be their most pertinent questions that we can't forget? And where do they expect us to reach them? Where is their turf? Third, and this one is so important for all of you in this room, especially. I think one of the biggest importances for your industry is understanding the power of emotion. Emotion is a driving factor of crisis, of escalation. And you deal with health on a massive scale. Health is linked to emotion, right? We want to keep our family, our loved ones, our children healthy and safe. When we look at the Milan crisis, that's what that was. You could anticipate the emotional impact that it would have and the power of that emotion to make this create noise and to start escalating the situation. With United Airlines, the most recent one, you could look at the emotional relatability of that video and say people are going to relate to this. They're going to see themselves as the passenger who's being mistreated. It's going to go viral, it's going to garner noise, and it's going to have long-term impact if we don't do something. So understanding the power of emotion is really key for understanding how something or if something is going to escalate. And on the flip side, it's key for your crisis response because you can never trump emotion with logic. And I'm putting myself with you guys. I'm a very logical person. I'm a strategist. I strategize crisis preparedness, crisis management. So I see logic. You are in the health sciences. I'm going to assume for the most part you're very logical people. You deal with stats, information. You deal with studies, science. And yet, your crises that you can experience are going to be triggered, and the most impactful part of them, one of them anyways, will be the emotional factor. So we can never trump emotion with logic. This means that you need to be able to take those facts, those stats, that science, the knowledge, and wrap it in a layer of emotional relatability in order to actually, in hectic times, in times of crisis, be able to actually reach. It's one thing to be on the platform and to have the answers to the questions. It's another thing to do it in a way that through the noise, through the emotion, that you're actually reaching people on a logical level. So I talked earlier about Emory. Emory, everybody in this room said it was issue, right? Anybody want to go back on that? Say crisis? The crisis was Ebola, right? Was caring for the 2 missionary doctors. And yet there is this minor crisis, potential crisis within the crisis of Ebola. And it's so real that it has a name. It's called Fear-Bola. It's true. I'm not making it up. Fear-Bola is the irrational fear of the disease. And it is pure emotional. So therefore, it is extremely real. And this could have potentially been more than an issue. It could have potentially, because of that, risen to the point where it would have impacted reputation. that fear of Ebola. So what Emory did was they knew this. When I spoke with them, they said, we knew that this was an issue. We knew it instinctively because we were crisis, or we are crisis ready. But we also knew that we needed to take a few minutes, not a long time, but a few minutes. I mean, we were blindsided. We didn't expect this to happen. So we were kind of taken aback, and we needed to sit down and assess and say, what's going on? How did this happen? Why is this happening? And when they did that, they did it very quickly. They didn't take days. They took a few minutes to an hour, let's say, while it was happening in real time. And they realized two things. They realized, one, the power of fearbola, that people irrationally, it's not logical, it's pure emotion, but people thought, really, that when these two missionary doctors were going to come off the plane and step on American soil, that basically they would cough and the country would get the plague, plague being Ebola. This is what they thought. This is the fear that consumed them and drove the narrative, drove the forces of the weight that Emory dealt with, all the challenges that they had to deal with in that moment. So that was the first thing that they realized through the comments. You're bringing the plague into America, as an example. The second thing was they realized that people didn't know, they kind of took for granted all of the training, all of the protocols, all of the word that they had prepared, all of the preparation that Emory went through to get to this point in the event that they needed to be here. The people didn't know that. Their community didn't know that. So there was this lack of understanding, knowledge, education on these two aspects. And yet, Emory just couldn't come out and say, it's okay, we're prepared, and you can't treat Ebola, or it's not gonna, the whole country isn't gonna drop dead when they get off the plane. You can't do that. So Emory very quickly strategized a campaign that they did over the course of a couple of days where they took all of the facts, all of the information, and they added that layer of emotional relatability to it so that it would actually be heard into the heart and then through to the mind. So reach the heart so that they let you into their mind, to their logical areas of their mind. And what they did was they put out fact sheets, they put out editorials, but they also did videos where you could see people, where you could feel them talking to you. People would be dressed in lab coats, so they'd look very official, but they would talk in a way that was emotionally relatable, that was human. They put out infographics so that you could visualize it, so that it's not necessarily an editorial that you're not going to read, and it worked. Just as quickly as the narrative went negative, it went positive. And all of a sudden, Emory is being bombarded on their pages with these wonderful messages of thank you, of gratitude. We appreciate you. So it was only in being prepared to understand, to be listening, to understand who they were speaking with, and to truly understand the emotional impact, the power of emotion that could have driven this particular incident to crisis level had they not been prepared, that Emory was able to successfully change the narrative of the story. It also helped that they successfully cured the two missionary doctors, of course, later on. But in the heat of the moment, this is before they even arrived. So those are the three things. They're simple, right? Anybody find this overwhelming? No, and yet changing culture, thank you. Changing culture can feel overwhelming to implement a crisis-ready culture. But it's about doing these three things and taking these three things and using them to empower your team, to train them, to allow them to understand what risk looks like and how to detect it, but also how to escalate it, what the high-risk scenarios are, what each stakeholder that they own the relationships will expect of the organization, and how to go ahead and empower them to meet those expectations. And then, of course, to understand the power of emotion, both how it can escalate an incident and work kind of against you, as well as how you can take the power of emotion and use it to communicate, to reach the hearts of the people that you need to communicate with on their turf in times of crisis. So these three steps go a really, really, really long way. And when we break it down like that, it's not overwhelming. And yet, you'll leave here, start doing that, and you'll be even more crisis ready than you are today. I want to leave you with one story. Since we're on the topic of Ebola, or talking about Ebola anyways, I want to leave you with a story that I find, year after year, it continues to inspire me. And it will show you the power of these simple three things. So, In the summer of 2014, Ebola was ferociously, kind of taking over, well, 3 countries, particularly in West Africa, but it was starting to spread in other areas of the world. And there were countless organizations, from humanitarian organizations to NGOs to government entities, that were proactively working every single day to manage this rising global crisis. And yet it was one unlikely entity that came up with a strategy by doing these 3 things that I'm talking about today. Does anybody know what that entity was? Nobody? The BBC. A world news organization came up with the tactic, the strategy to manage the crisis of Ebola. So here's what they did. The BBC, when Ebola was spreading so quickly, like everybody else, they said, okay, what's going on? They really, really sought to understand the problem, the rising risk, or the risk that was actually materializing. It was turned into a problem at this point. And they realized through their quest for knowledge that the problem, the biggest problem, was that West Africans don't have access to resources, information, and education the way that we're very privileged to have access to and oftentimes take for granted in our areas of the world. So as a result, they were increasingly exposing themselves to the virus, and they didn't know it. So for example, they have this beautiful ritual within their culture where they actually, to say goodbye to a deceased loved one, they actually touch the body. But nobody told them that you can catch Ebola from a dead body. So they were increasingly exposing themselves to the virus, and they didn't know it. So the BBC said, okay, if education is the answer, how can we seek to educate these communities directly? This was the million-dollar question that everybody was trying to figure out. And yet, the tactics that they were trying, the other organizations, brilliant organizations doing brilliant work, but they were trying traditional means of communication, radio, pamphlets, the things that have worked in the past. But because the BBC is very evolutionary, let's say, they're very technically savvy, and they realized that, they said, okay, but maybe there's a better way. And they sought to truly understand the stakeholder, the audience group, West Africans. And in this quest for knowledge, they learned that West Africans as a society, they love the app WhatsApp. You guys, anybody not know what this app is? And it's okay if you don't know. It's a text message-based app. That's it. It's a free app. West Africans as a society love this app so much that when they go to the store, I spoke with Trushar Barrett, who's the editor and who's responsible for this initiative with the BBC. He said that we learned that when West Africans go to the store to buy a smartphone, they don't say, I'm looking for a smartphone, I'm looking for an iPhone, I'm looking for an Android. They say, I'd like a WhatsApp phone, please. So they use this app every day to communicate with their loved ones. It's part of their culture. And the BBC saw this as an opportunity to meet the stakeholder on their turf. So they launched what they called the WhatsApp Ebola service. This service was intended to be a 6-week initiative. What it did was it sent 3 pieces of educational information every day, both in English and French, through this app to the communities within West Africa that were being affected with Ebola, or by Ebola. And it worked. The other thing that they needed to do was what they realized was that a big portion of this population is also illiterate. So it was really important that it reached everybody in a way that could be comprehended by everybody. So they put out pictures. They did collaborations with local artists that would put out 60-second audio clips, songs and stuff by artists that the communities in those areas loved and knew. So they got that emotional relatability factor. And it worked. Within a couple of weeks, all of those other organizations that were proactively trying to do the same thing came to the BBC and said, oh my goodness, this is working. How can we help you? How can we push this even further? And a 6-week initiative, or what was meant to be a 6-week initiative, ended up lasting over 6 months and is the reason that we started to manage the world crisis of Ebola. There's a lot of power in understanding risk, crisis versus issue, your high-risk scenarios. There's a lot of power in taking that and aligning it with understanding your stakeholders, what you can expect them to expect of you, and where to go to give them and meet their expectations. And then, of course, there's a lot of power in communication when you understand the impact, the power of emotion. It's 3 simple things that you can do right now that will put you in a position to be so much more crisis ready. Because it's not about having a plan that simply sits on a shelf that is what everybody relies on. And it's also not about anymore allowing or having it so that leadership owns the crisis management. Today, it's everybody's responsibility. And it's about building these programs that you then take and you train, empower, embed into the culture of your organization. I'm sure you can tell I'm extremely passionate about crisis management because of the possibilities, the opportunities that it presents today to take very negative situations and use them to actually come out of them with more trust of your stakeholders rather than a deficit. And I hope that I've shared that a little bit with you. And be the catalyst, do this internally, start moving your organization to be crisis ready, and enjoy the process, because the more you learn, honestly, the more this empowers so many other areas of the organization, not just for crisis management. That's my experience. Thank you so much for your time.